The remembrance will continue here after the panels today, tomorrow, with another busy schedule that includes a special guest speaker, Dr. Usta Kaitesi, the acting CEO of the Rwanda Governance Board, as well as the program's keynote speaker, General Romeo Dallaire, who was the force commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, who disobeyed orders to withdraw, and along with a small contingent of Ghanaian and Tunisian soldiers and military observers, did his best to protect those who sought refuge with the UN forces. Today, we're focusing, as I understand it, more on Rwanda itself, and we're just delighted to join the organizers and the other sponsors, including the Embassy of Rwanda. And I'm very, very indebted to my very dear friend and amazing person, Imwakale Songa, for all the work that she's done on this as well. So welcome again, and I really look forward to fruitful discussions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean Newton, for your thoughtful introduction. And in the interest of time, we are going to get right to the heart of the panel today for session one. And I will briefly highlight just the structure of the panel. So we will bring forth our panelists. We will sit in conversation style, and I will introduce them with a brief bio, and then we'll give them their chance to speak on some remarks they've prepared today, and then we'll jump right into Q&A discussion as time allots. Okay. If I could please ask our panelists to come forward for session one. Good morning, everyone. So this first session this morning will focus on genocide awareness and prevention, and our panelists have graciously prepared some remarks for us to get the conversation started. They're all experts in their own rights, and we look forward to hearing what they have started and prepared for us. So I will start with introducing Dr. Jean-Marie Kamatali. He's a tenured professor of law and the director of the Center for Democratic Governance and Rule of Law at Ohio Northern University Law School. He is a former dean of the law school at the University of Rwanda and has taught at different universities, including the Notre Dame Law School, Indiana University in South Bend, the Kent State University, as well as Louvain University in Belgium. His publications have focused on the accountability for genocide and crimes against humanity, the rule of law and human rights, and he is a regular consultant for the UN Office on Genocide Prevention. And he will briefly give a history of the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsi. Then to his right, we have Marie-Rose Gatete. She's a general accountant manager at Con Selmer in Elkhart, Indiana. She is married to Gaetan Gatete, who's in the audience, and has two children, Gabe and Jao. She's a graduate of the University of Notre Dame with an executive MBA, and she holds a bachelor in accounting and a bachelor in business administration from IU South Bend. And she's a certified CPA who's been extremely involved in the community as current board member for the YWCA and on the finance committee for the Red Cross. And we will look forward to hearing remarks from her on the role of the United Nations and world leaders in preventing genocide. Then to her right, we have Dr. Charles Rufuku, who is a science professor at Ivy Tech College here in Elkhart. He practiced medicine at Mugonera Hospital, an SDA mission hospital in Rwanda, where he was the director of that hospital. He also had a private surgical practice in Kigali, and Dr. Rufuku graduated from the Friendship University in Moscow, and where he graduated as a physician. He moved to the United States in 1987 and worked at St. Joe Hospital before moving into academia. And Dr. Rufuku will discuss the roots of genocide and using Rwanda as a case study specifically. And then to his right, we have Pamela Cronkite, who is an educator, administrator, and a small business owner who aims to prepare and equip those she works with to make positive contributions within the community. And after more than 2 decades in the classroom and as a facilitator, Pamela believes the highest outcome of education and training is when it is transformational and used for greater good. She's raised thousands of dollars with her students for charity, And the system she's created improved profitability and outcomes for organizations and businesses she's led. But her greatest source of joy and pride is in her marriage of 26 years and her 3 children. She holds a BA in history and social science from Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and an educational administration from the National Louis University, and has 32 additional postgraduate hours in educational leadership at Aurora University. Ms. Cronkite will reflect on her 2-week journey in Rwanda. And I will give the floor. Yeah.
If you want to be on the podium, or if you want to do it from there.
Just like asking if I want to be on podium or sit down, and just my teaching background kind of like forces me to stand up. I hope that's fine. So I'll try to be fast because I know we have really a good panel here to talk about different aspects. I'll just give the background. The good thing about talking first is just I can say whatever I want, and then others will just fill in whatever I didn't say. So when you look at just background about Rwanda is the location, just give you the location for those who are not familiar, and it's just the location being on the side with the surrounding Tanzania, Uganda, DRC, just for background for people who may not be familiar with that. And really, Rwanda is a beautiful place. I'm not going to tell you how beautiful it is. I know that somebody will talk about it after spending some time in Rwanda, so the hills and everything. So, and this is, the beauty and everything. But it's also the problem Rwanda is known for this genocide, which is unfortunate. So the problem is really how did we get here in April 1994, where genocide against the Tutsi happened. And I'll just give a little bit of background to give you an idea that Rwanda, did not start the way we know. It used to be kind of started with a very small hill and in a lake called Muhazi, Rwanda, Rwagasabo. So that was run by kings, and this is kind of like some of the kings of Rwanda. And Rwanda, before independence, was much bigger than the way it is, but the Berlin Conference kind of shrank it in a way that is smaller the way it is now. And the background is really that the ethnicity was more a social class than ethnicity, what we know ethnicity. So there was a possibility of moving a mobility between these ethnicity until colonialism, and then colonialism came, and kind of like in 1930s, they developed these theories. We will be talking about tomorrow the role of academicians in really transforming, using theories to divide people. So the way they kind of transform by, it's kind of surprising how most genocides and Holocaust is just based on how long is your nose, which is unfortunate in a human history where people were discriminated based on the way they look, and then kind of like the Belgians introduced an ethnicity showing the Hutu Tutsi as part of the ethnicity, and then from that time it became more ethnicity than a social class that was actually in the beginning with the possibility of mobility. And then the colonialism really kind of like it's impossible to talk about genocide without talking about the role of colonialists, because the division colonialists introduced with the idea that Hutu and Tutsis are from different origins. Tutsis are from Ethiopia and Hutus are from Zaire. So this background kind of like started dividing Rwandan society, and then labeling Tutsi or the king, part of the ruling as the oppressors and Hutus as oppressed, and then destroying really the monarchy institutions. Some who are familiar with the Rwandan history will tell you that Rwandan monarchy was organized in a way that people know about like states. It was like states with almost like executive and judicial. Everything was structured in a way that kingdoms like Rwanda, Burundi, Monomotapa, those are kind of kingdoms that were really structured in a way that allows people to see that the state, as we know it, could develop in a system like in Africa. And then the colonialists, before independence, kind of blamed the fight for independence on Tutsi, and that kind of led to 1959 killing of Tutsis, sending Tutsis into exile, burning their property, and then creating then the Hutu ideology, which was more based on the leaders who came immediately after the the independence. So all the leaders after 1961, 1994 were kind of based on more ideology of majority, Hutu majority, and they kind of excluding the minorities, which was, and unfortunate, once you govern dividing society, of course, the idea that you end up finding genocide is really the reality. So, but then in 1990s, as you probably, for some people familiar with the end of Cold War, initially before, whenever minorities were fighting to claim their rights, it was either you are connected to the socialists, you are communist, or you are imperialist. So that was before the end of Cold War. But the end of Cold War kind of opened the opportunity for people to claim their rights and developing human rights as we know it. And that kind of allowed people to speak up. So in 1990s, we know that in most African countries started kind of developing a multi-party system. And then also in 1990s, that's when the RPF, under the leadership of President Kagame, kind of like attacking 1990s, trying to claim their rights. And then, of course, what happened after the UN came in and tried to kind of like work towards negotiation, and the peace accord was achieved. But then, because the ideology that existed in Rwanda, it did not really go anywhere, because the ideology of Hutu powers and also the ideology of division was already ingrained in the Rwandan society, that was almost too late to kind of like bring the peace. And then the militias, building on that ideology, collected, tools and then taught and everything. And that was also helped with media. That was media of hate, for people who are familiar with Kangura, and also the Radio Mikolin, which I think somebody will be talking about later on, try to show that actually the ideology that existed, ideology of genocide that existed in Rwanda since the 1950s, was kind of like channeled through the media and also the radio that was promoting it. And then, of course, as we'll be talking about, the level of atrocity that happened in 1994 did not really happen by accident. It was a part of a training, on a teaching, and everything that's been happening in the country for a long. So the fact that there was the President Habyarimana plan was shut down was used as an excuse to kind of continue the plan that was already into place. And then genocide, of course, happened, and that is how in 1994, the 1 million Tutsi were killed. So, and it kind of like want to kind of highlight here. And as I said, I'll try to be fast so that we can have an opportunity to discuss in general. But what happened in Rwanda is genocide in all its elements, all its definitions. I'll try to kind of look at the elements from a legal perspective, but others will be talking about from other perspective. But what happened in Rwanda, if you look at the definition of genocide, I mean, genocide, any committed with the intent to destroy, in a whole in part, a national, ethnic, racial, religious group. So this is exactly what happened from a legal definition of genocide. So I'm always surprised when people try to kind of like try to dig holes and try to figure out whether this or that is not. So all these elements happen one by one. And of course, this definition has to understand that some countries can broaden this definition, but this is the definition of the convention that defines what is genocide. So I'll go fast again to give you some of the elements of genocide, for some being part of the law school sponsoring it, just like every crime will have, of course, these two elements, actus reus and also mens rea. So genocide is the crime of crimes. I mean, I'm kind of like, it's not just any crime. This is why, as much as we listen to media and everything, we call everything genocide. Genocide, for people who really underwent genocide, will tell you that there are killings, there are other aspects, but genocide is when everything has reached that level of the extreme. And that is why the biggest difference here is really the mens rea, the act of committed with the intent to destroy in a whole in part the targeted group, which is exactly what happened in Rwanda against the Tutsi. When you look at the intent was there, to destroy was there, and you can find these elements in the way this was happening. And then kind of the acts which we mentioned here, these acts here, killing members of group, causing serious bodily, all these acts happened in 1994 against the Tutsi, and then the second, that is act was committed against a specifically targeted national, ethnic, racial. This is the definition again. So I'll try to kind of like use the ICTR elements to show you that elements of genocide, the way they were defined by the ICTR and all courts, can be found in what happened in Rwanda in 1994 against the Tutsis. And so in trying to define when there is intent to destroy, the statement of perpetrators, the militias, what they said, calling Tutsis cockroaches, kind of like the song that were happening, it was, you cannot look at it and say this was not overt statement. There were overt statements during the killings and before killings. So those statements exist to prove that the intent was there. The intent can also be coming from the surrounding facts. You don't kill 1 million people and say that the intent was not to destroy a whole group. So this is a very clear element to show that. And then of course you have to strike a balance between words and deeds. So if you say you want to exterminate Tutsis and you kill them, so where else did you find the intent? So the intent was there before, was during, and it was even after. When you look at people denying genocide, what they do, they're actually trying to prove that actually those acts did exist. So this is, although they kind of try to walk backward, but it's actually what happened. So the plan of policy, people say, oh, they didn't find the plan. Legally, you don't need a plan to show that genocide did happen. Although in Rwanda the plan existed, you don't even need to show that it was a plan, but in order to show that. But the plan existed there, so somehow you cannot use the element that we did not find a plan. Legal evidence is a bit higher than political elements. So there was a plan, but that plan, the fact that it was not maybe clearly used in court does not mean that it did not exist. But even that, you cannot use as an excuse to say that genocide did not happen. So perpetrators need not to have key coordinator roles. So some people say, oh, I was not part of it, and I was not really very much involved. That's not an excuse either. So you can still be found guilty of genocide even if you did not have a key role. And then also, people will say, no, for me, I never hated Tutsis, and I was kind of like a good person. That's not also an excuse to prove that you did not commit genocide. Genocide, you can be found guilty of genocide without necessarily showing that, before I was married a Tutsi, as friend of Tutsi. That's not an excuse to justify or at least to show that you did not commit the crime. So, and then also the selected assistance of victims. There are some people who say, well, I helped Tutsis and I was hiding Tutsis, so I did not commit it. That's not anything. You are punished for the acts you committed, not the fact that you assisted. So the fact that you assisted 1 or 2 Tutsis but then killed a number does not absolve you from the crime. So not sufficient evidence of lack of intent. You cannot say, oh, I was not enthusiastic, I was reluctant, I was pushed to go and kill. You cannot say that, I did not have a hardline, I did not have personal motive. So all these elements really show that there is intent in committing crimes as part of widespread or systematic attack does not imply lack of genocide intent. So all these elements, so the intent has been redefined by the tribunal and ICTR and courts to a point that all the excuses used by either researchers and others, they do not make any sense because they do not remove the existence of genocide. So I kind of see people deny genocide using some of these arguments, and these arguments do not even show that they can get away with the genocide. Need not show that anti-ethnic group adherence or affiliation with extremist group. So all these elements are really necessary. So the whole in part is also the element that is included in the definition, and that very last, it must be shown that the intent of the perpetrators was to destroy the substantial part of the group. So, and then not necessary to show the intent of complete annihilation. Some people say, oh, there are Tutsis who still exist. So that is also an excuse because the fact that they did not succeed in exterminating the whole Tutsi does not mean that they not committed genocide. That argument should not be also be acceptable. So the numbers also does not matter. We'll talk about it later on, talking about a researcher who is connected to some university saying that, oh, the numbers, what is the number, correct, not correct. Not necessary to establish a genocide throughout the country. It's not necessary to. So the destruction, of course, also means material destruction, and that is sexual violence can form an integral part of a process. I think somebody will talk about it, how it was included. So try to go fast again, the national ethnicity. The definition of the way ICTR kind of like made it possible. The new approach, group determined subjective and objective criteria on a case by case. So it's not anymore like, oh, is a Tutsi, how do you define a Tutsi? So that was kind of like also the ICTR defined the best way of how a Tutsi was a group protected under the convention. So just to go fast, knowing how much time do you have, just trying to be, 2 minutes, okay. So I want to kind of go fast a little bit to show you the key element of the characteristic. I mean, some of the element difference between genocide, looking at these elements, looking at crimes against humanity, because the distinction has to be made between when there is a genocide, when there is a crime against humanity, and when there is a war crime. So some people have to kind of make this difference to understand that all killings do not necessarily qualify genocide, because it can be genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in general, so that the distinction is made. And the kind of particularity of the genocide in Rwanda are really kind of like a speed. If you look at the number of people killed, 1 million Tutsi killed in 100 days, high participation of citizens in killing. People killed the relatives, which is actually the extreme. So, and that's relatives, neighbors, friends, use of traditional weapons in killing. So these are kind of some of the key characteristics. Deep horror, like asking people to dig their own grave and hitting the children, wars, or transmitting HIV to raped women, eating persons. This is kind of the horror of genocide, and this is what happened in Rwanda. And government was involved, some religious groups were involved too. There also something which will be talked about, the failure of the United Nations. If you look at the failure of the United Nations, it shows that the United Nations is old, it's mighty and everything. It proved that there is really something wrong about the United Nations, the way it intervenes, the way it stopped genocide, because, and I'll go on and tell you how in 2004, the UN was trying to figure out who was really responsible. Was it Dallaire on the field? Was it Kofi Annan at the UN trying to kind of like about the facts? Was it, again, the member of Security Council who would say, okay, I was getting instruction from the State Department or so who is actually, because once you start opening the layer of the United Nations, you realize sometimes it's a good onion, but inside you find that who is responsible for everything. It's really difficult. So that's the failure. But also, the key element really people have to understand, there is hope. If you look at the way Rwanda reconstructed, it really shows that reconciliation and forgiveness are possible. I mean, people will talk about it today. And the way that good governance matters, because bad governance is the one that led to genocide, and you can see the reconstruction being based on really good governance. The aspect of economic development as a base tool, and also the fact that there is a possibility to combine a justice that looks at forgiveness, truth, reconciliation, and that is possible. So justice does not have to be retributive. It can combine forgiveness, truth, and reconciliation, and Rwanda has proven that this is possible. So again, I have to be fast, and I'm assuming that maybe through discussions we'll be able to have a Q&A to answer any of these elements.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We'll just ask Ms. Gatete to move the conversation forward. Yeah.
That's okay. Good morning. I sit all day, so anytime I get an opportunity to stand up, I do. So All right, we will talk a little bit about the role of UN and what leaders in preventing the genocide. Did they really do it? So I did a little bit of research so I can have something to share with you. And then later on, we can discuss and ask questions. And I'm sure here we have some people who worked at the UN who will be able to assist. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of a definition of UN. As you all know, it's a global diplomatic and political organization dedicated to international peace and stability. And UN started after the horrific event of the World War II in 1945. It started with only 51 members, and now it has 193 members. So what are the main goals of UN? As we all know, it's to maintain international peace and security and to develop relations, friendly relations among nations, and also achieve international cooperation, solving international problems. So when we look at the UN, and within the UN, they have different departments and different pieces of departments that are, one of them is the one who has the duty to prevent the genocide. So within that particular department, I was able to see what were the main goals when they say that this is the Office of Preventing the Genocide. So the first one was to raise awareness, just to make sure that people knows when any atrocity is being committed around the world, just to raise awareness and tell people who are supposed to do something or to stop, or alerting, which in the same, correcting all the information so all the information can be disseminated to the right people, and also advocating, talking to the world leaders and to see how they can prevent the genocide or any other atrocities. And also they had the International Criminal Tribunal to punish those committed the genocide. However, when you look at the case of Rwanda, it looks like UN failed on all the accounts. So as far as raising the genocide, raising the awareness, there are so many times they hold meetings and they didn't want to discuss that genocide was happening in Rwanda. Dr. Kamatari discussed all the elements of the genocide. Those elements were right there in April. However, they were still discussing, should we call it genocide or not? And we all know that they didn't want to call it genocide because they didn't want to be responsible that the genocide is happening in Rwanda, hence we have to send troops, and we have to act. And alerting, when we look at this particular element of alerting, General Dallaire sent so many messages alerting that something is going on. They are preparing the genocide. There was an informant who informed him that they had a list of Tutsi to be killed. They had purchased weapons, machetes, but all the messages that were sent, they never reached the right people. The person who will get the message, we say, oh, we're just gonna put it on the side. Advocating, we didn't have anybody to advocate for us. UN Security Council, they say that they didn't even need 2,500. General Dallaire had asked for 8,000. They say no, 5,000. Later on, they say no, 2,400. During the genocide, they pulled the troop. We had only 240. So you can see that we didn't really have anyone on our side. United States of America, they launched a campaign advocating and trying to convince everybody that they need to pull all the troops. I can name only like a couple of people during one of the meetings, the Nigerian UN ambassador, Ibrahim Gambari, and the British UN ambassador, Mr. Henney. They convinced the UN ambassador to United Nations, Madeleine Albright, to change her position because she had said that they are pulling all the troops. So these two wonderful people, they convinced her to change her position. If it was not for probably these two people, they would have pulled all the troops and all the Tutsi would have been wiped. So later on, they voted for France to intervene. However, when the French get there, they created really a safe haven for the killers to exit and also to continue to kill people. So they will help one person, but they will also, on the other side, shield the killers and they continue to do their missions. So as far as the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, yes, they have that one, but we're still struggling with it. As you can see, they indicted 93 people, 61 only were sentenced, and 14 acquitted. The court is closing, but even those sentenced, they are talking about releasing them on the basis of age or that they are sick. However, they killed people. They have to stay, they have to be sentenced and stay in jail. So anyway, after all this, they created a special office in 2004 to see what went wrong. Because as you can see, everything that they tried to do failed. They didn't do anything to help the people of Rwanda. They failed all of us. So I'm just here summarizing quickly what Washington did. The cable was sent to Washington detailing what was going to happen. They ignored. And everybody, this UN wearing Jai, who also sent a report saying that he is sure that they are organizing people to kill the Tutsi. They have a list already made, but they ignored. Instead, most of them, as you can see, they were talking about pulling troops. They wanted to protect just their people. Belgians were sending troops so they can rescue the Belgians and then get out the troops. Britain were doing the same. United States were doing the same. They were just sending troops so they can help all Americans get out of the country safe. Even high people in UN, they were receiving messages, but they were ignoring. They were not sharing any message with anybody. I have a list of some of the messages that were sent, and it's a very long list. It's almost every day, General Dallaire was sending a cable saying what's going on, telling them the findings, telling them where they found machetes, arms, asking, begging, can I go and stop it? And they will say, no, your mandate is not to stop the genocide. Negotiate, don't do anything else. So United Nations failed us. World leaders failed us, as you know. After the genocide, after seeing the casualty, the numbers of Tutsi that were killed, I am assuming that they start thinking, should we really stick to our position and say genocide didn't happen? So slowly, one by one, they started visiting Rwanda and they started apologizing. President Clinton went to visit Rwanda and apologized in 1998. French president apologized 2010. Canadians, they apologized in 2010. New Zealand, I can name a list. They are still going there and apologizing. the Catholic Church. Finally, in 2016, they accepted that members of Catholic Church participated in the genocide against the Tutsi. People seek refuge in churches when priests say, this is a safe haven, come. Once there, they get slaughtered. So what are the lessons learned from what happened in 1994 genocide? We all know the United Nations and the world leaders, they failed us. So just going back and seeing the events, how it happened, what happened during the genocide for 100 days, what we need to do, we need to stop being indifferent. We should not be indifferent when we see catastrophes or anything wrong happening. Even for students, if you see bullying, you need to act. As responsible citizens, we need to make our leaders accountable for their actions. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, they moved forward and stopped the genocide when they were asking them to stop and negotiate. If they have not decided to act right away and stop the genocide, I am sure all Tutsi will have been wiped. In the end, I believe that all of us have the power to make a difference. The only thing we have to do is to act. We must be willing to act in order for never again to be a reality. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I would ask Dr. Rufuku to give us some remarks as well. And feel free to remain in your seats. I can give you a mic.
Thank you. I was asked to talk about the roots of genocide in Rwanda, the genocide against the Tutsi. And I choose two topics among them because there is a lot of things we can talk about. And my colleague here, my co-panelist, mentioned some of them. But there is no way we can understand what happened in our country, Rwanda, without talking about decolonialism. And if we talk about colonialism, we need to go back to the relationship, politically or economically, between Africa and Europe. And the beginning, everything started in the mid-80s when Europe started being interested in Africa. Let's pick up a period when the Europe started being interested in Africa. For which reason? First, Europe started losing their interest in America. America became independent, become self-economically, and did not rely on Europe anymore, and Europe could not rely on America anymore. So there was this boom of industrialization, and they need raw material to develop industry in England, in the rest of Germany, and so on. So they start being interested in Africa because there was a raw material that they need. And they start sending people we call explorer, to go to find out what kind of this land that they do not, that was stranger for them, because it was undercovered. It was a virgin land, and nobody ever been there. We cannot talk about this exploration without mentioning two people. First, there was, when we talk about Central Africa, we talk about Livingstone, who was a missionary sent by a mission church to go explore Africa. And then he disappeared one time. I'm not going to go into detail what he did. And they sent another journalist, Henry Stanley, to go to find him. Stanley, when he got through the Africa, he passed by East Africa and entered in Central Africa, found Livingstone, but he kept exploring. And he returned to Europe. He came with a big document trying to impress the prince, the government, to fund the exploration of Africa and exploit, of course, the resource that was huge in Africa. Stanley didn't find many interested capitalists to help him. So one person, Leopold II of Belgium, be interested of what Stanley have discovered, send him back and say, can you curve through this land, virgin land, Africa, that's unknown, a land that I can call mine. So Leopold II and Stanley make this big map of Africa. And Stanley returned in Africa and reached almost Rwanda. And he didn't enter in Rwanda because Rwanda was a very nice organized country. And he could not. They tell him, don't go there because they're going to fight against you and you're going to lose. So he didn't enter the Rwanda personally, but he sent some mission, spies to look what's going to happen, what is behind that land and how organized they are. The story is not, I wanted to show some image, but some images are very disturbing. The way the Congo Belge was colonized by Leopold II. It was his ownership. The Congo Belge at the beginning belonged to Leopold II, personally. And he tried, even they call Leopold II one of the most cruel person in the war. Just like they talk about Hitler or Stalin and so on. But his intention was humanitarian, but he needed to find riches and wealth from Europe, from Congo. There was gold, there was ivory, there was rubber. You remember that time? Rubber was the most precious things that you can find, and it is not the rubber we have now, coming from petroleum product or chemicals. It was needed to be planted and then harvested and so on. And he planted all the, and he got a lot of wealth from Congo: gold, rubber, ivory from the elephant, and all kind of the product that make him very rich person. The country he covered in Africa was 18 times bigger than his own country. Congo is bigger than Europe. The west part of the Europe. And that big land need to be exploited by all means. For that, they need to establish what we call the corvée. Corvée is, it is a forced labor to produce all this work, all this product that the Europe needed. So you need to mobilize the people to work. And if we don't understand this understanding of Corvée, we will never understanding the genocide in Rwanda. The understanding of this, we need the use, of course, people. And there was a forced labor, very cruel. They needed to have a certain quota of the product they need to produce. If they don't, they will wipe up the whole village, burn their house, chop their hand, and so on, so that they can force them to work. This story went through many people were interested to describe this cruelty through the Europe, in Congo. And it happened that some people become very sensitive to this situation. The Rwanda was not at that time belonging to Congo Belge. So we didn't see much this effect in Rwanda, because Rwanda belonged to Eastern Africa, which is a part, East Africa, the part that was colonized by Germany. But sooner or later, all these powers in Europe come together under the conference we call the Berlin Conferences. And they divide Africa in their possession. Germany, Belgium. Well, Belgium was not very powerful at that time. It is more country and it still is. But they consider that because of the King Leopold II, who has big chunk of Congo under his possession. Making the history short, after dividing the country and impose this labor, forced labor, in Rwanda, there was necessary to build roads, churches, administrative building, and all these things of infrastructure that needed for infrastructure for the country. So the Belgian found the idea is the poor people, the one that possess nothing, will do this forced labor. The one that have cows and wealthy will be exempted from this work. And we, most of the time, we're the Tutsis. And because they have cows and so on, which was the wealthy at that time. And instead to do the labor, they pay taxes for per capita for the cow they have. So the one that have no cow become what? Become the laborers that need to build the roads, the churches, the things like that, all the infrastructure. So in Rwanda, they form two classes. The one who are doing the labor, and the one that are exempt from the labors. And most of the time was the Tutsi. How to recognize them? Because physically, it will be very hard to distinguish these two groups of people. So they impose ideas, identity cards. And in the identity card, they mention if you are Tutsi or Hutu. The Hutu need to do the labor, and the Tutsi exempt from the labor. That was the origin, the roots of all this discrimination and dividing people in categories. You know, this politics in the colonial time we call divide and reign, right? If you want to dominate, you need to divide the people. So in Rwanda, they divide the people. This is not Rwanda stuff. This to divide the Tutsi and Hutu is not, the root is not a Rwanda philosophy. I I am at this age, I never hear my father or my mother mention the name of Hutu or Tutsi. From the time I have been a little kid and to the time I'm grown up and so on, never in my family we mentioned that names. So it was something that was imposed to us so that they can get their cheap and free labor and taxes. So that we created a class, two classes. One is a kind of a privileged, and the other one that is what? Is, I can say even enslaved. And when it was a time of, there's another person, this time of imperialism, that the time of Leopold and so on, origin of this terror and horror and so on, and forced labor, the time of colonialism that now the Europeans started installing themselves and imposing their politics and so on. And now the time now when the Africans feel like they need to be free and independent, and that's the time now, the beginning of the ideology of dividing and prepare for genocide. That time, it was like 59, the 50s in Rwanda, there was a movement of independence, right? And when the Belgians feel like Africa want to be free, that's where now they divide, and now they change their code. They, instead to sustain the Tutsi, they sustain they favorite the Hutu and turn around so that they can impose another politics. So that is how the origin of the genocide for the Tutsi. Another topic that maybe I cannot mention, which is the root of Rwanda politics, is the politics of Gacaca. Gacaca was one of the solutions. And in one word, the Gacaca have been very positive in Rwanda because it decriminalizes people. After the genocide, everybody thinks that the Hutu is a criminal, it is a murderer, it is the bad guy, and the Tutsi is the good guy. In the village, that's how they consider that. But with this Gacaca, when people sit and talk, and the system of judiciary, traditional judicial system, they say, this is the one who murdered, not because he's a Hutu, but he's the person who is a criminal. This is not a criminal. This one is a criminal. That's a give reconciliation, and people feel free. We recognize now who was the criminal, who was the victim, and this was like the beginning of unit and reconciliation and the progress we see now in Rwanda. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ifuku. And now I will turn it to Pamela Kong, right? Yeah, that sounds great.
Good morning. I think somebody's going to come and start my PowerPoint. I want to say thank you for the honor of being here today. In no way do I come as expert, but I come as an educator and I come as a friend. And I'm just grateful to be here. Every once in a while, a moment, a person, an opportunity presents itself, and the only right thing to do is to say yes. I don't know how many times these moments have passed me by, but it did not on that Thursday afternoon in the summer of 2012. With courage, dignity, and pain, Immaculée Mukuntaganira shared her story of survival, loss, grief, and forgiveness to a room full of strangers, eager to learn and understand. I told her that I would love to see what she was talking about. She told me that she would love to show me, and I said yes. That began a journey for me as an educator. Actually, in 2009, I became a high school teacher at Ottawa High School in Ottawa, Illinois. They were starting a new program called Freshman Academy, and I was invited to be a participant in that academy, and we were creating our own curriculum. And we had the opportunity to be intentional about how we built a year-long program. And the year was culminating in a genocide unit. And after a year long of teaching world history and global studies to freshmen in high school, and in a program whose goals were stated to be real-world problems and solutions, I was challenged with how can we find any solution in a curriculum of global studies that teaches so many sad stories and so much conflict filled with hate. And we began exploring and discovering. So as I was teaching the Rwandan genocide for the first time, and if any of you are teachers here, sometimes you know that you're just one step ahead of the students, where you're learning the night before what you need to express. I was confronted with the idea of how much I did not know about this piece of history that happened when I was a young, newly married adult in America. I could reference a time when Kurt Cobain had committed suicide, even though I wasn't a Nirvana fan. But that same week, there was a tragedy that was coming to a head and unfolding so large, and I was mostly oblivious. As a teacher, that created a problem for me. So I began learning, and I was curious, and I so wanted my students to have a different experience than what I had had. So here I was in the summer of 2013, and I was landing in this airport that I had taught about, the airport where the president had taken off on April 6th, and his plane was shot down, and I was landing in this journey of history. I was able on this very first day to go see the Milcolline, what many Americans do reference as a Rwandan experience, and I was able to see it in its lush, restored glory. I was able to go on this journey with a young friend, Megan, and my 15-year-old daughter, Carly, who had just completed her freshman year in our program. When we were there, we got to experience all that is fantastic about Rwanda, that many of you have experienced your own selves. It's its own rich cultural experience. I could talk to you about those lush green hills, and I could talk to you about that sweet, milky black tea and chapati and crepes, or that perfect cup of coffee that's grown on those Rwandan hills. But that's not what made this trip so transformational. Immaculée is my friend that I met at the Illinois Holocaust Museum at that conference when I had said yes in response to her story. And she was able to take us into the homes of Tutsi survivors, and she was able to share with us her journey. Immaculée's story is her own to tell, but I was obviously struck with her losses, which include her husband, her 2 daughters, her brother. And she so graciously shared with us her journey. On our first full day in Rwanda, we went to Mass. And it didn't take me long to realize that we were in the place where her brother had been staying on that very first day of the genocide in 1994. Her brother, a Catholic priest, who was staying on the grounds and was one of the very first victims on that first day of the genocide. We were on those grounds of that church participating in worship, participating in a joint celebration of life and of hope. After service, we wandered to the backyard, and this was my first experience at a memorial site, a mass grave, where there's many, but it includes Immaculée's brother. And my understanding of what this experience was started to unfold. I'm not going to share the day-by-day details of a trip, but I do want to share some of the most meaningful components of our journey. This is the Kigali Genocide Memorial at the heart of Kigali, where over 250,000 Tutsi have been laid to rest. That in itself is just a sentence, a statement, a fact that can take your breath away. Anytime we were at one of these memorial sites, we were led on our journey by a survivor. This survivor had survived in a soccer stadium or a football stadium, and he told us how his little brother had been born in that football stadium. One of the gifts that Immaculate gave us is allowing us to participate in the honoring of the dead and participate in the grief. She had ordered flowers to bring, which is traditional. That was new to my experience. This is not how I have grieved. So the flowers were ordered, carefully prepared, and she had us lay them on the open grave. If you've not been there, there are open graves as they continue to find remains of the victims of the genocide, and we participated. Immaculate joined us on the journey inside of the genocide center. It's all profound. The story's completely gripping. But one of the most gripping experiences for me, for my 15-year-old daughter, was in the children's exhibit, where there's just picture after picture of children. And a number like 1 million becomes a number of 1. I was looking at the identity of these kids, and they would say, 10 years old, his favorite sport was football. He enjoyed making people laugh. He dreamt of becoming a doctor. His last words were, UNAMIR will come for us, the UN. He was tortured to death. I teach a lesson to our freshmen on identity at the beginning of the year as we start our journey. We explore what makes us human, what makes us individuals, what makes us different. It's things like football, wanting to make people laugh, dreams of becoming a doctor. Coming through that exhibit, we're out on the terrace. There's just not a lot of words, and I'm with my daughter, and I'm thinking about what I teach. At the end of the year, when we're trying to find hope with our freshmen to empower them, we don't want to just learn stories of pain without being empowered to do something. I don't want to just give them facts that make them more knowledgeable at a trivia game. It became clear to me that part of the pain in my friend's story was that her 2 daughters were not in a memorial. Their pictures were not hung. There was not a stone that had their names engraved. She did not know where their bodies were. She did not know what their last days or their last moments were. That's a grief, and that's something that I could join in. I had already started the process of thinking about what we could do, but I wanted to become part of that story. I don't know if you've ever been a teacher or if you've ever had plans with freshmen, but the plans didn't work out quite as I wanted to. But we tried for the next year to come up with a plan and a way to memorialize these girls, and then the next year, and finally 3 years later. Another memorial that we went to was Murambi. Murambi is unique in that it's a story where on a night 25 years ago this week, up to 50,000 people, maybe more, were massacred in one evening at this school that was still being constructed, a technical school. Their bodies were so quickly disposed of in mass graves that many of the bodies did not have a chance to decompose. And in these unfinished classrooms at this technical school is an entire row of rooms that are filled with these non-decomposed bodies of the victims of Murambi's massacre. Again, I was with my young friend, I was with my daughter, I was with Immaculate. Again, I was struck with the individualness of these victims, their shoes, their plastic beads, the rosaries, the dresses. and observing the bodies that were laid out on wooden racks in the classrooms. Some of them still had hair, some of them still had clothes, some of them were locked in an embrace. These were individuals. This was not just a million, it was a whole lot of ones. I grew up in a pastor's home. In fact, my dad is here. And 2 of my 3 brothers are pastors. So I'm just fairly familiar with the Psalm, Psalm 23. But when I was standing on this grassy hillside of Murrumbee, Psalm 23 came to me in a way that I had never, ever considered. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. You are with me. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely, surely goodness and mercy will follow me. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. As we continued our journey through the weeks in Rwanda, and we were in the southern portion of Rwanda, we drove through these beautiful forests. And being familiar with my friend's story, I wondered what this forest would say if I could hear it talk. The stories it knows, the people it's embraced. And again, I was struck with its beauty. The final memorial that we visited was at the University of Rwanda in Butare. This is where Immaculate's husband was laid to rest. And again, she prepared flowers in advance to lay on the grave. When we went to pick up the flowers the night before we were going to go, they were unacceptable. They were unacceptable for the respect she wanted to show. And so we waited and reordered flowers so that there was a proper honoring that could be done. When I think about a transformational journey, it's not just seeing sights, it's not just hearing stories. It's walking alongside in that process and seeing how grief is done, how forgiveness is done. I was able to teach freshman girls in Rwanda. I was able to be on the other side of the world and see how many things in common these freshman girls had in common with my freshmen in Ottawa, Illinois. I did the same identity poem lesson that I do at home, talking about the things that make us individual. And their poems were remarkably similar, the things that made them them, that made them important and made them incredibly special on this planet. We were able to visit with some children from different non-government organizations who had been sponsored by some of our students, some of our friends. We were able to see what that work looks like if we participate. But one of the things I'm most happy about is that 3 years later, after attempt 1, attempt 2, attempt 3, our culminating project in our classroom is what can we do to make this world better? And the students have to come up with a project, and they either volunteer service hours or they create a fundraiser and they research organizations. But this particular year, and it was finally in 2016 that we were able to get it done, enough funds were raised to create a well for Rwanda. The organization that we had normally used no longer did memorial wells, and I so wanted this to be a memorial well for Clarice and Raisa. So Immaculate got to work, and she found the engineers, she found the civil organizations in Rwanda that could create the well. And we were able to get that well memorialized. And it says, in honor of the lives of Clarice and Raisa. And finally, officially, these girls have their names on a plaque, and the world knows they were here. But long before their names were on this plaque, the world knew they were here. Their story is told in my classroom. Their story empowers freshmen, often overlooked as world changers. But just a couple years ago, Immaculée was able to go to the place where she had chosen for this well to be. And the place that she had chosen was in the village of where the killers of her family lived. That's not how I would have picked it. It's not how my mind works. I would have thought that she would have served her friends and her family. And she says so matter-of-factly, if it's not education and it's not love, the story never changes. So right there, in this place of so much pain for her family, there's so much love. There is so much life. And Clarice and Raisa are remembered. Today, they are in a memorial site, but their story was important before it had this finish. I saw this out on a poster outside too. This is in Murrumbee, a quote on the wall that struck me. If you knew me, and if you really knew yourself, you would not have killed me. That's what I'm about. I want people to know people. I want people to know themselves. And I believe that's where our hope is. Elie Wiesel, he says the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And my goal is to not just be transformed myself, but to transformed. So my new friends in Rwanda, our host families, they were all survivors. And the grief is still palpable, but their strength and their courage and their hard work of rebuilding, of forgiveness, of beauty, it's evident, it's obvious. I can't not see it. I can't not taste it or hear it or feel it. It's a context for my own suffering. It's a context for my own unforgiveness, for my relationships with my family, my friends, strangers. It's a context for beauty. Rwanda is in me, and I'm so glad.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for that. And to all of our wonderful panelists for really giving a lot to us to unpack. Dr. Kamatali discussed the codified international laws around genocide and this idea of mens rea, or acts committed with intent to destroy, to try to understand this responsibility to act within United Nations law. But then Ms. Gatete talked about this sort of conflict between laws being there, but generally the inability to act sometimes at the international level because of different geopolitical and other factors. Dr. Fuku spent a lot of time on the impact of colonialism and its lasting legacy generally and the direct linkages to genocide for Rwanda, but generally around the conflicts that can happen, and the traditional judicial systems in helping the Rwandan people to move forward in a restorative manner. And Ms. Conkright discussed the intentionality of education around genocide, but generally leading the next generation in awareness. And also what I found profound was how do you understand grief at a mass scale and help people to move forward, and just also humanize the stories of others that might be far away from your own life. We have a lot to unpack. There's 10 minutes left before our session 1 ends, so definitely feel free to address these panelists. I'll get us started with one question, but then we'll open it up for Q&A. There are 2 mics over there on the other side as well, so feel free to begin lining up with any sort of burning questions. And just to start us off, and any of our panelists, feel free to take this question, but Veskatete talked a lot about the different levels within the United Nations around like raising awareness and the responsibility to alert and advocate that international organizations had. And we traditionally also saw this with countries, but in our modern society and this connected world where we're no longer relying on international bodies or political or politicians, do you all think that this changes any sort of calculus, whether it's moral or political or legal, in order to act when acts of genocide are committed, since we can no longer be in our own bubble where we're not seeing it and we're having acts that are like being broadcasted in real time? Does that change any of the calculus around these responsibilities to act and the idea that we can't really say we didn't see it coming? There are mics that are strewn all about.
Okay, I think we have to be hopeful in order to live, otherwise life will not have any meaning. And I have to say that unfortunately with the UN, it's very difficult because the UN was created at the time where the problems that existed and the problems we have now are completely different. And I'm kind of looking at it from the perspective I mentioned before. In 2004, so a group of Rwandans and some scholars were at the UN and were trying to figure out exactly what happened. And everyone was there, and was the Dallaire kind of stood up and talked about everything he did, and then say that he sent the fax. And then that time, Kofi Annan, who was in charge of humanitarian affairs, is the one who stood up and said, okay, I got the facts, and you say, and then I gave them to Boutros Ghali, who was the Secretary General, and say, okay, we say, okay, Dallaire, you're fine, and then we say, okay, Kofi Annan, you're fine, you did your job, and then you kind of move to the Boutros Ghali, and Boutros Ghali was saying that I mentioned that in the room of Security Council, member of Security Council. And Security Council, as you know, is made of permanent members, the United States and France and other places. And the problem was that when you go to the Security Council, everyone in Security Council stopped being the UN. It was just now, it was an American, it was a French, it was a Brit. So you end up finding that the organization that was supposed to be the United Nations being like handed over now to countries for their own interests. So you have a representative of the United States saying, I was working on instructions from the State Department. The French saying I was working on instructions of my government. So, and then you say, where is the UN now? And this is actually the problem we find with the United Nations, in a way that the structure that exists now does not allow to have that action, because the UN does not have its own army, does not have its own force. So it has to rely on states. And those states have to be consulting with the State Department, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then you end up looking at the role, and this is the point I really want to mention, that the power starts with you, citizens. Because if you hold these politicians accountable, then they will make the United Nations also accountable. And the good thing we have here, for instance, in 1994, there were not many Rwandans like the ones you may find here. So they're probably, I don't know who was the first Rwandan to come to Notre Dame here or in Indiana, but you'll find that the power now the citizens have to call the congressman, to call on the government, to speak in the United Nations, start from the citizens. So we cannot sit in Rwanda and say the United Nations is there to do something if we don't have people like Rose Gatete or other citizens who can call on elected officials to hold the State Department accountable, and the State Department speak in Security Council, and then the Security Council talking about the United Nations. If we don't move from that perspective and think that things will be top down, I don't think we'll get anywhere.
Do we have any questions from the audience? You feel free to stand up at the mic back there.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. My name is Tony Raymond Chirabira from Uganda. I'm here in my Master of Law, International Human Rights, and it's a pleasure to hear from you. I just have two questions. In regards to the prosecutions that went on in Tanzania, what is your opinion about their success? Do you think that they were able to provide some reconciliation? I mean, the impact. Then secondly, when I looked at the program and I saw genocide against the Tutsi, I was a little worried, to be honest, because I believe that there are always two sides to a conflict like this, basing on the fact that even in the prosecutions, we had different groups of people that were convicted. So I would have loved to also see statistics about the other minorities or groups that were also affected by the genocide. Thank you.
So would anyone like to take that first question around reconciliation and the question around if there was true reconciliation? And then another panelist or more could take the question around why it is called the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis specifically.
I think I will answer the question about the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. I don't know if you were here when we started this conference, and Dr. Kamatari explained the meaning of the genocide, or the elements that are needed to say that this is the genocide. It has to be a target, and it has to be an intent. I don't remember all the elements, but you can see that in the case of Rwanda, the target was on Tutsi. The identity card that said Tutsi, that was the basis of the killings. So anyone with the identity card saying Tutsi was on the side to be killed. Anyone with those features that they explained that the Belgians had, said this is a Tutsi because she's tall, her nose is shaped this way, or her eyes, the person was going to be killed. So just to answer a question, it was a target. Anyone called a Hutu at that time was able to survive. So Tutsi were on the side, on the line of fire, and Hutus were safe. That's why, they called it the genocide against Tutsis. No Hutu was a target during the genocide.
I really find disturbing when somebody look at genocide and say there are both sides. I don't understand when you kind of like, I hope that's not what you meant, right? Is that what you meant, both sides? I mean, this is like the story saying when it comes to genocide, it's very clear and it's been established by courts, it's been established by everybody that the genocide that happened in Rwanda was a genocide against the Tutsi. I don't know what the reference you were maybe starting from, and I hope maybe that's not what you meant to say. Genocide, the elements we talked about has to be separated from other crimes that were committed. And that's why I made sure that we make a distinction between crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So when we talk about genocide, which is a crime up there, I think we should not fall in the discourse of journalists who will see every killing and call it genocide. So we have to be very clear and very specific that when we're talking about genocide, there is no both sides. It's never been established. There's no conclusion whatsoever. So that discussion, I think, we do not even have to entertain that. We can talk about crimes committed, other crimes committed, war crimes, crimes against humanity. We can talk about people who were killed as a part of revenge. But nobody in Rwanda has ever been killed because there was a Tutsi. Because there was a Hutu. So this is something which has to be understood, that if there was somebody revenge, I can give you an example, for instance, in some of the societies where a soldier will get back and kill somebody because he killed his family. I mean, his family. That is not necessarily the elements of intent we talked about did not exist. So what makes a genocide is not the killing, is not the intent to exterminate as a whole or part a specific protected group, meaning the Tutsi in this very specific case. So that's a very clear, I think that has to be understood. The point you mentioned about the ICTR, I think, which is very important to keep in mind, is that, I mean, we have to see the international justice in the context of international. So ICTR has had many objectives. And the contribution ICTR in the development of international criminal law is well known. Nobody would discuss that ICTR contributed to the development of international criminal law. If you're studying law, you know that some of the cases, when you look at rape as a genocide, thanks to ICTR, the punishment of first genocide in the context of Akayesu, we know about it. The role of media, the way kind of like the distinction between what is speech that is acceptable, that is not acceptable, thanks to ICTR. So we have to give it credit. But when it comes to building reconciliation in Rwanda, we have to be careful, because the government of Rwanda, when it was trying to get ICTR established, and they're putting ICTR in Arusha, did not help Rwandans reconcile, because reconciliation requires actually to have the people, the feeling like the people committed atrocities feel guilty. They have to show remorse. They have to, and the victims have to see that happening. So when you take a court far away, like it was in Arusha, when you make sure that you look at answering international issues rather than look at the victims. I mean, how can you see a person, I mean, the examples I'm giving here is, we have people who are victims in Rwanda, and the people who were raped and do not have any treatment of AIDS. They don't have anything being taken care of. And we have people committed genocide being in Arusha with TV, with hot shower and everything. Not that they should not get it, but at least if you're gonna treat them that way, treat the victim the same way. Not give a five-star treatment to those who commit atrocities, and then leave the victims on the other side. So that's where the problem of reconciliation and contribution ICTR becomes really a problem. But as far as development international law, that's fine. But as far as reconciliation is concerned, it's kind of like some people would doubt on whether ICTR was really geared toward reconciling Rwandans or not.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm sure a lot of you have additional questions, and we can keep the conversations going into subsequent sessions. So in the interest of time, we're going to close this session and give you 2 minutes to kind of stretch your legs, use the restroom, and we will set up here on the technical side and get started with session 2 in about 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists. This was really wonderful.